The recorder. So good morning, those of you who are on the stream. Those of you at K-Talk Radio, you're listening to the Jack Stockwell Radio Talk Show program, Truth Without a Muzzle on Global Affairs Unfiltered. And marvelous stuff to talk about this morning. Been trying to catch up, especially with hostages being released right now. I was watching on TV this morning. It looks like several of them have been released. The living hostages, of course, will be handed over to the IDF or the Israeli government. It's expected that the remains of the fallen hostages will be transferred as well. Bodies of dead hostages will be transferred in a painful and respectful ceremony, they said, to the Institute of Forensic Medicine for identification. Now, why are they dead? Well, when you look at the level of IDF bombing of Gaza, I'm surprised any of them are alive. A top Hamas official by the name of Osama Hamdan appeared to confirm that schedule that's going on right now, telling AFP News that, quote, according to the signed agreement, the prisoner exchange is set to begin on Monday morning as agreed, and there are no developments on this matter. Then he said that after Israel verifies the identities of the bodies it received, then a multinational task force will start searching for any bodies still in Gaza that the terror group cannot locate. Again, why can the terror group Hamas not locate them? Because they have been bombed into total annihilation. He said, we demand, expect, and work for 100% effort from Hamas with the assistance of the international force in order to complete the mission and bring back all the fallen hostages for burial in Israel. So it's interesting that they do not attribute the missing hostages, some of which may or may not be alive, or the dead ones, to some kind of mishandling on the part of Hamas. Because they know darn well why those people are dead. So Israel has known since before ratifying the agreement last week that some of the dead hostages may not be located. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been aware of the possibility for months. 3 Israeli officials told CNN that 7 to 9 bodies might not be retrieved, while another put the figure between 10 and 15. But following the return of the hostages, the big thing is that Israel will proceed with the release of about 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Of those, 250 are security prisoners who are serving life terms for the deadly terror attacks, while another 1,700 are Gazan detainees arrested over the course of the 2-year war. Now, interestingly enough, no discussion, even though the Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel and Haaretz, of course, have all talked about how half of the people that were killed that morning on October 7th were killed by the IDF. That's they don't talk about that too much anymore. I guess they don't want to spoil the chance of the return of some of these hostages. However, it's all PR anyway. As soon as Israel what do you think Israel is going to do as soon as they get the living hostages back? Go their own way and create a 2-state solution? They will get right back to why Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Israel this last week and in Egypt today, I think, getting ready for the big palatial rebuilding of Gaza and turning it into a resort. And the only way they can do that is to get rid of the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, I don't think you can pay them enough to leave. I really don't. It's their home. It's been their homeland for thousands of years. They have no intention of leaving. And I think as soon as the living hostages have been returned to Israel, the fighting will continue again. Now, part of the peace deal is for Hamas to lay down their weapons and show the IDF where the tunnels are. And if Hamas is smart enough, they won't lay down all their weapons, and they won't show where all the hotels, where all the tunnels are, as this thing continues. Now, there's something else that took place. Anytime Ted Postel speaks, I've got to talk to you about it. There were several events that took place this week in Berlin, which emphasized the danger to Germany posed by the stationing of these Tomahawks. I'll talk some more about the Tomahawks before the program's over. But now that the fellow who failed to win the peace prize, of course he won it. He just won it indirectly through that lady from wasn't Argentina. Anyway, I'll remember here in a second. The lady who is a hardcore MAGA, South American MAGA person, who says she dedicates it to Trump. Well, they couldn't give the peace prize to Trump when he's supporting the continuing destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza. So they did it indirectly, but that's a subject for another moment. Anyway, Ted Postel was in Germany talking to them about this crazy idea of bringing Tomahawk missiles into Germany. Another step closer to the outbreak of World War III. Now, one of these events was a 3-hour discussion by Professor Postel, MIT professor, co-organized by the Schiller Institute and the Eurasian Society. And the topic was the threat of positioning medium-range missiles in Germany, including a very sober analysis of what a nuclear war would mean if it were to break out, as I have talked about several times in the past, what Professor Postel has to say about that. And he explained the incredibly destructive potential of modern nuclear weapons, which are today orders of magnitude more powerful than the weapons used that killed 200 to 250,000 people in Japan there in August of 1945. He exposed the absurd idea of winning a nuclear war, showing that what is called winning is usually turned into an absurdity when the country that wins has nobody left alive after the war's over. So he debunked the myth of victory in a tactical nuclear war and demonstrated that with the use of only one nuclear weapon, a resultant war ending all life on Earth, he recounted his own experiences in nuclear war planning, especially with the problem of reduced early warning time. Now, up until recently, we always had like a 30-minute warning. If Russia were to launch something over the North Pole, which is the quickest access to the United States, down over Canada, it would be about 30 minutes from the time we picked up through the DEW, the distant early warning system that lines northern Canada. It's part of the United States defense system. Once they picked up a launch, either by satellite or by the DEW line, you'd have about a 30-minute warning. And so Postel's talking about how this time period for a warning is getting shorter and shorter all the time. And so he said in 1983, there was a war game called Able Archer. And in that war game, top American leadership was involved in playing and simulating from a social, psychological, military perspective a confrontation between the Warsaw Pact and NATO where nuclear weapons are used. He said, now it's important to understand that much of what happened in this game was driven by military imperatives. And the problem, again, in this case, comes from the nature of nuclear weapons. He says they are so powerful that once one side starts to use them against the other, each side feels compelled to strike back and destroy as much of the enemy's strike power as possible. He says you don't have a choice once you're in the game. You can't say, Okay, that's enough. Let's stop now. Because you don't know that the adversary is going to escalate before they stop. He says this gives the adversary a chance to escalate in a way that causes you even more damage. So you get forced into a cycle where you have to strike the enemy, where you feel you need to strike the enemy to keep the enemy under control. Now, this counter-strike situation is fundamental to military thinking about nuclear war thinking. Because the thinking is you can fight and win. Well, there is no winning in a nuclear war, as we will see, he says. That idea has to do with a structure that falsely creates the idea that a war with nuclear weapons is not very different than a war with conventional weapons. And that's not true, because the levels of damage are so great that both sides get destroyed. So there is no winning in any sense. And then he also critiqued the self-defeating policy of the German government of placing these weapons on German soil, a policy that makes Germany, without any good reason, a target for nuclear destruction in case of war. But he also lamented the ever faster growing sense of reality among the political leadership in the West, the decline of their sense of reality, I mean. The more they open their mouths and speak, the more obvious it becomes they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And he says that's a dangerous driver in and of itself, because the inability to comprehend the consequences of their policy takes us a step closer to the using of that policy. And then what followed was a lively Q&A in which several of the activists expressing their deep worry about the political situation in Germany and their appreciation for Postel's clear and present explanation as to how serious things are. Now, a couple more things here. Russia is warning Moldova is about to make a grave mistake. Moldova, it looks like there's efforts to turn Moldova into the next Ukraine, but maybe not. Maybe not. All right, let me move on to something else here. The TASS has reported, I haven't seen a whole lot of this anywhere else. This is a few days ago. But TASS had reported that Poland is moving 5,000 battle-ready troops to its borders, threatening Kaliningrad. Now, you remember Kaliningrad, this little Russian enclave that is surrounded by Lithuania. And it's sticking out in the Baltic Sea. But it's a piece of land that Russia says is Russia. And there's some debate in the area as to whether it is or not, but that doesn't matter because of what is sitting there at Kaliningrad. So the headlines here just last week from TASS, Poland moving troops to its borders, rehearsing Kaliningrad's blockade. Now, this isn't the best comparison, but it should give you a good idea. Let's just say that Utah County is just an extension of Salt Lake City. And the Salt Lake City government controls what's going on in Utah County. But the only access to Utah County is along I-15. And so south of Salt Lake City would be South Salt Lake. And then all the other little hamlets and everything south of there, Mill Creek, Murray, Sandy, South Jordan, Draper, everything that borders I-15 south of the Salt Lake City line would be an enemy to Salt Lake City and an enemy to Utah County. But Salt Lake City's land access is down I-15. And so Salt Lake City has warned all the little cities along I-15 to the point of the mountain, you do not bother our Salt Lake City trucks going to and fro along I-15 to Utah County, or there will be hell to pay. Well, that's kind of where Kaliningrad is sitting. You have to go through Lithuania to get to Kaliningrad. And so this highway's been set up for that kind of transfer to take place. Now, Russian military expert Alexander Stepanov's contention that Poland's president, Nawrocki, who signed this decree on October 3rd, that formally authorizes the deployment of military forces to support the border guard along the borders with Germany and Lithuania is part of a plan to blockade Russia's Kaliningrad region. And as I said, located on the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad is a Russian enclave region and city that borders Poland and Lithuania. So Stepanov says that Poland's movement of armed forces are not spontaneous actions. He says the legal formalization and justification of their movements under the pretext of ensuring public safety in border areas is in fact aimed at forming echeloned cordons in the event of an attempt to blockade the Kaliningrad region and contain the Russian forces deployed there. Now, Stepanov, who's the program director of the Russian Academy of Political Sciences, pointed out that such Polish military actions could be a sign of preparation for hostile actions such as logistics blockades, airspace closures, and neutralizing the Baltic Fleet's retaliatory capabilities. So according to the expert, Poland, along with the Baltic states, is one of the leaders in saturating the Russian border with HIMARS missile systems with ATACMS and GMLRs. Now, under President Nawrocki's decree, Poland is in the process of moving up to 5,000 troops to its borders with Germany and Lithuania. And Kaliningrad, as you well know or should know, has an arsenal of missiles, including Iskander nuclear-capable ballistic missiles, the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, the Bastion P anti-ship missiles, and the S-400 air defense systems. And as well, Kaliningrad, one of Russia's largest industrial centers, is the headquarters of the Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet. And yet these absolutely crazy things continue to take place, either to provoke Russia or to set up a red flag, which I think is coming. I said last week that I really thought Israel would be attacking Iran by Christmas. I'm moving that up to Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is, 7 weeks maybe away, less than 2 months. I think, and that's the intent of Netanyahu anyway. So you see all this stuff about how they're going to turn the Gaza into the Eastern Mediterranean Riviera with golf courses and hotels and casinos and swimming pools and whatever else. It's a guise, of course, to cover what they're really after, which is the oil and gas fields that belong to Gaza, belong to the Palestinians. They're going to steal that every much as they're going to steal their land, just as they're stealing land in the West Bank right now. So even though this seeming peaceful ceasefire, and you notice how Netanyahu only calls it a ceasefire. Other leaders are referring it to a sure sign of the end of the conflict, the end of the war. Netanyahu never uses that. All he ever says is it's a ceasefire. He never calls it the end of the war. And as soon as they've got the living hostages back, as soon as they have the remains of the non-living hostages back, or at least most of them, and when they're ready to push the button for the attack on Iran, it won't matter how many of the deceased hostages at this point they have back, because they're not necessarily nearly as important as the living ones. And you're going to see Israel reach out and attack Iran, with the United States' help, of course. They can't do it without the help of the United States. And speaking of that, the Tomahawk missiles can only be fired with American help. You can't just turn some remote control button switch over to the Ukrainians. Now we're selling the Tomahawks to Norway. The Norwegians are going to sell them to the Ukrainians. It's just absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. And with that, Moscow is charging the United Kingdom, preparing stage incidents to put the blame on Russia. So, sabotaging a Ukrainian naval ship or a foreign civilian vessel in a European port, after which London would accuse Moscow of having orchestrated the attack. The Russians are coming out and talking about this openly now, so when it happens, they can say, aha, we told you. And even the UK's Princess Anne, do you remember her? She's King Charles's older sister. She's a member of the House of Windsor Inner Corps. And at the request of the British Foreign Office, she made a secret visit to the Ukraine on September 30, where she met with Zelensky. Just why? What might she be carrying over there? Well, just more marching orders for Zelensky, of course, because the Royal House of Britain is, with increasing the tempo, intervening into London's foreign policy with the Ukraine, sometimes on behalf of the Foreign Office, sometimes goes beyond the Foreign Office. But what's really happening here is how much power and control the royal family still has. It's one of the great contradictions of freedom that you have this parliamentary government in the UK. Who owns the parliament? Whose government is the parliament sitting over? No. Whose government is the parliament reigning over? Well, it's not this government of the civilians of the UK. It's the king. It's the king's parliament. It's the king's government, which is why, with the placing of a new prime minister, before he moves into 10 Downing Street, he's in Buckingham Palace meeting with the regal head of the royal family, which is now King Charles. And so that King Charles can say, oh, okay, let's see what you can do with my government. Now, it looks like Charles may not be up to this himself, or they didn't need the public display. So he sends his older sister over there, and Buckingham Palace, of course, is playing up all the ostensible charity visits, claiming over 19,500 Ukrainian children have been transferred or deported by Russian forces to Russia and Ukraine's occupied territories. Despite this gross distortion, there is likely some pressing matter involved for the British Foreign Office to request that Anne urgently make this secret trip. Well, it didn't stay secret for very long. Even though Charles is having direct meetings with Zelensky and what appears to be the king taking the actor under his wing for advancing the interests of the British Empire. And one of the major interests of the British Empire, of course, is the end of Russia. And Charles, who's a fanatical Russophobe, said to Zelensky, I feel the greatest and deepest admiration for the unbreakable courage and spirit of the Ukrainian people. Yeah, just how do they say this stuff and keep a straight face? Anyway, the UK is still very intimately involved with what is taking place in the Ukraine, because this is, we hear the idea that it's NATO's war against Russia, and the United States is 75% of NATO, so it's the United States war against Russia. But what it really boils down to, it's the city of London, the city of London's war with Russia. Now, Scott Ritter, who I catch his podcast as often as I can. I don't always get it every week, but he posted an article on his Substack channel back on the 6th, which is what, a week ago, warning that, quote, arms control teeters on the brink of extinction, and with it all of humanity. Now, in his article, he begins by reporting that the New START treaty, the last of the arms control treaties, expires February 5th of next year. And despite the fact that Russian President Putin has offered to extend the limitations of the treaty for another year, the United States has not responded. So Ritter goes on to say, quote, this is disconcerting since the purpose of the moratorium isn't to simply prevent an arms race in the short term, but also buy time for negotiations that would result in a new treaty framework that takes into account the complexities surrounding the issue of nuclear weapons and arms control today. Then Ritter quotes Putin in his comments at the Valdai conference last week, that Russia can determine what happens over the next year by themselves, but Ritter says, but what happens beyond that, it's hard to tell. There's a lot of things left to figure out. If we know that there are people in the U.S. who say they don't need any kind of arms control, then neither do we. Overall, we're okay, he said. We're sure of our nuclear shield. We know that we need to do tomorrow and after that. He didn't say that. He's quoting leaders in America saying that. We don't need arms control. We have our nuclear shield, and we know what we're capable of doing today and tomorrow. So on the role of China, Putin said the West wants to keep them in the treaty, but he says, why are we leaving the French and the United Kingdom nuclear potentials behind? They're NATO members, by the way. They want to provide their nuclear umbrella for the whole of Europe. So Ritter says President Trump is not being well served by his administration. And Ritter has said this more than once, that Trump is getting some very bad advice from some of the people the closest to him, and pointing to the fact that Vice President Vance and General Keith Kellogg have both hinted that they may support deploying Tomahawk missiles to the Ukraine. And then Ritter again quotes Putin from Reuters. This is, using Tomahawks without direct involvement of the U.S. officers is impossible, which means a completely new, qualitative new stage of escalation, including in relations between Russia and the United States. So Russia reminds us that in December of 2024, then President-elect Trump told Time magazine, regarding Biden's agreement to allow Ukraine to use the U.S.-provided Atacam missiles to strike targets inside of Russia, he said, I disagree very vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. Why are we doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse. That should not have been allowed to be done. Now they're doing not only missiles, but they're doing other types of missiles. And I think that's a very big mistake, very big mistake. That's your president. And so with Trump on the verge of making a very big mistake by agreeing the use of Tomahawks in Ukraine, Ritter says Congress should be called upon to pass a resolution banning the U.S. from providing the Tomahawk missile to the Ukraine, as well as providing intelligence support to assist Ukraine in targeting these and other missiles. He proposes the wording for that resolution. Quote, congressional intervention is needed to wake the Trump administration up about the inconsistency of its policy positions regarding the supply of long-range missiles to Ukraine and the danger such policies pose to the larger issue of strategic nuclear arms control. It could also jolt the Trump administration into addressing Putin's offer of a new START moratorium and the need to begin a comprehensive review of U.S. arms control policies and priorities. And then Ritter concluded, one mistake, one miscalculation, and the world could very well find itself confronting the horrific reality of a nuclear Armageddon. Let's give peace a chance. Congress should act now to keep still the missiles of October. And yet they just continue to push it and push it and push it. And I think this is part of the reason while you keep seeing kind of a flip-floppy behavior on the part of President Trump when it comes to certain comments he makes about this stuff, to the point where I'm seriously beginning to wonder if he might not be slipping. Has that occurred to you? When you look at President Trump's presentation a week ago, the hour-long presentation he gave to the General Assembly of the UN, and just talking about himself and talking about his ideals for America, rather than issues that would involve the United Nations. And then his press conference with Netanyahu, and then the third thing he did. What was that third thing? To the generals and admirals at Quantico last Monday. I don't know, man. That monotone voice of his. He didn't used to speak monotone. Not when he was running for office. There's another little thing here that I want to mention. You know the old saying that when they start shooting flak, when you start taking on flak, you know you're over the target. There are 6 former U.S. Surgeons General who served under Democratic and Republican administrations, signed an October 7th open letter published in the Washington Post, warning you and me, warning the whole nation about Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And the letter states that RFK has rejected science, misled the public, and compromised the health of Americans. The nation deserves a Health and Human Services Secretary who is committed to scientific integrity and can restore morale and trust in our public health agencies. You're not going to reestablish trust in the FDA or the CDC by who sits at the head of it. The only way you can reestablish trust, the only way you can clean out a rat-infested basement is to turn on the lights, the bright lights, clean out all the garbage, clean out all the little hiding places, clean the whole thing out so there's not one drop of rat food left, like under-the-table payoffs kind of rat food. Then you might start to put out some new cleaner policies on the part of those basement operations. You're not going to restore trust in this country to the FDA or the CDC without doing something as drastic as that. So the letter further states, over recent months, we have watched with increasing alarm as the foundations of our nation's public health system have been undermined. Science and expertise have taken a backseat to ideology and misinformation. Morale has plummeted in our health agencies. Talent is fleeing at a time when we are facing rising threats, from resurgent infectious diseases to worsening chronic illnesses. Kennedy has spent decades advancing dangerous and discredited claims about vaccines, most notoriously the thoroughly discredited theory that childhood vaccines cause autism. He has promoted misinformation about the HPV vaccine, which protects against cervical cancer, and he has repeatedly misrepresented the risks of mRNA technology and coronavirus vaccines despite their life-saving impact during the pandemic. Boy, I can hardly get that out without throwing up my breakfast. The letter continues, repairing this damage requires a leader who respects scientific integrity and transparency, listens to experts, who can restore trust to the federal health apparatus. Instead, Kennedy has become a driving force behind this crisis. Then the letter was signed by Dr. Jerome Adams, Dr. Richard Carmona, Dr. Jocelyn Elders, Vivek Murthy, Antonia Novello, and David Satcher, former attorneys general. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. I was listening to, I don't know if it was one of the social things. Someone had sent it to me about a fellow who the only thing he knows and believes is what he sees every single night on Fox News. It was kind of funny the way they presented it. Not MSNBC, not CNN, just Fox News. All he knows is what they tell him on Fox News. And of course, Fox News is completely controlled by AIPAC and Israel. And all you have to do is just listen to their policy statements. And when I hear that kind of stuff, and I see what Kennedy is being accused of, he's promoted misinformation about the HPV vaccine. Do you know what kind of science, peer-reviewed, published information there is on the HPV that causes brain damage? I took care of a young lady for a while. When she was brought to me, she was in a wheelchair and couldn't move. By the time I had worked on her a dozen times over maybe a year's period, she could stand up out of the wheelchair. She still couldn't speak, but she could stand up and with some assistance walk around. At least I got her out of the wheelchair. And a higher level of consciousness, that it was obvious that she was very cognizant of everything that was going on around her. And a lot of the palsy in her upper extremities had calmed down, but she still couldn't write and she still couldn't speak. But she, could blink her eyes for yes and no and that kind of stuff. And that was an HPV vaccine damage. In fact, I saw the brain scans where there's big old hole, just a big old hole in one of her temporal lobes of nothing, just emptiness, missing brain matter. Multiple HPV experts have been to court testifying it was the vaccine that caused that problem with the ways in which they knew it. And then this idea that he said that vaccines are caused by autism. He never came out and said vaccines are caused by autism. He said this needs to be looked at in a very scientific, objective research project to look at all of the information relative to it, because it seems very, very credible to claim there's a relationship between vaccines and autism. Now, if I had nothing more to go on myself than the mothers of autistic children, whose autistic children I have taken care of in my clinic, the stories they would tell, that sometimes within hours, within a day or two of a shot, the child's personality was totally different, went out the window. There's no telling these women that shot didn't cause their child's autism. Now, I don't want to talk about vaccines and autism, because what I want to mention is what Kennedy actually said. And he has said this before several legislative committees in both the House and the Senate. He says there's no research, there's no safety research. And the members of the various committees are shocked to hear this. Literally shocked. What do you mean there's no safety studies? And he said, well, show me. Show me the safety studies. Maybe I've missed it. Now, the thing I've mentioned regarding safety studies several times on my program over 30 years, as if there was one really, really good randomized crossover double-blind study on the relationship between vaccines and autism, where vaccines were shown not to cause autism, It would be on every front page of every paper in America. It would be the subject day long, day in, day out on the talk programs on television and the news programs. But you don't see that happening because there aren't safety studies. Now, I'm not going to take time to get any further than that. I've talked many shows about this. There are no safety studies. Now, this terzepatide and semaglutide that people are using to destroy their gastric ability to handle certain foods. Well, I've lost 45 pounds. Well, that's wonderful. Now let's see what happens when you stop the drug. See if your body just bounces back to where it was before. My point is, what I'm trying to say here is, those drugs had safety studies. The drugs for heart had safety studies. How good were the safety studies is not an issue. Who paid for the safety studies is not an issue. There are published safety studies. Whether the studies are good or not, whether they're scientific or not, whether they're conclusive or not, there's published safety studies for all the drugs that are out there in the marketplace, except vaccines. And they're not about to do it. And I told you why before. I'll tell you again. Please, I'm not trying to be condescending. It's because it's considered unethical to do a safety study on vaccines, because you have to have a control group. And that control group is not going to get a vaccine where the study group will. And it's unethical to take a group of kids and not give them the vaccine. What an argument. Anyway, these 6 former generals are warning about Kennedy. And the letter continues, repairing this damage requires a leader who respects scientific integrity and transparency, listens to experts, and can restore trust to the federal health apparatus. Instead, Kennedy has become a driving force behind this crisis. Yeah, he's a driving force behind the crisis because he's exposing it. And he says, we need a leader who respects scientific integrity and transparency. That's all Kennedy's asking for. Give us some integrity and transparency. Give us safety studies. He has been vaccinated. All his children have been vaccinated. He says, I'm not anti-vax. I just want safety studies. Is that absolutely too much to ask for? Now, I wanted to make a comment about President and Hegseth's appearance before the military leaders last Monday. The Hill reported on the 7th that Secretary of Defense Hegseth's, quote, my way or the highway message to hundreds of generals and admirals at Quantico has sparked fears that there are a lot of some of the top leaders of the military who are choosing to bow out of the U.S. military entirely. This is Don Christensen, a retired Air Force journal, former military lawyer who watched the speech, said this. His speech directly attacked the values of many of the senior officers and enlisted members in the audience, and I would expect many of them to demonstrate their disgust by retiring. Indeed, 2 senior officers quit last week, further inflaming those fears. Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas Boussier announced his retirement last week after the White House withdrew his nominations to be Air Force Vice Chief of Staff. General Brian Fenton, head of U.S. Special Operations Command, also announced his retirement, but after 3 years on the job with the Pentagon, he said it had nothing to do with Hegseth's speech. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution think tank, said he doubts there will be a mass exodus, but he does sense widespread anxiety among those in the armed forces. He says, when I talk to military officers, they have a range of views. Most of them don't want to pick a fight with Trump. Well, they know what will happen. Most of them are not at the point of considering resignation. Some of them even like certain aspects of this administration. You put it all together, there are very few people who are indifferent to these kinds of dramatic events. Carrie Lee, L-E-E, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund, said she would not be surprised to see more resignations, particularly in the Army. She pointed out that Hegseth failed to address personnel issues with the Army commanders that are dealing with, including sexual assault and high suicide rate. She said for many of the officers who are responsible for formations of troops and watched the suicide epidemic really ravage their units and have watched sexual assault tear units apart, to then be told that we don't care about that anymore, when the Army is really a people organization. It doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of folk who aren't going to stick around for that. Now, a little primer here on the Tomahawk cruise missile. And this comes from Wikipedia. You can read this for yourself, but it's very interesting. I know Wikipedia is a liberal publication. And Wikipedia is really nasty towards alternative healthcare issues. I've read this. I've read what's there. But when it comes to stuff like this, I think it's pretty accurate. Now, the Tomahawk missile flies about the speed of a commercial jet. So if a commercial jet takes off from SFO, from San Francisco, flying to Kansas City, and you launch a Tomahawk about the same time, they'll both get there about the same time. Well, no, they won't. The Tomahawk won't make it. Tomahawk range is about 1,000 miles. But for that 1,000-mile of trip, they'll be neck and neck in the sky. That's about the same speed. When you see these jets flying overhead, commercial jets, see them streaking across the sky with their little contrails, how hard do you think it would take a missile to shoot those down? Well, obviously, that's kind of a dumb question, because it would be no object at all for a ground-based air, surface-to-air missile, a SAM, to take out a commercial plane full of people. This happens. So the idea of putting Tomahawks into Germany to fly hundreds of miles to hit targets inside of Russia is absolutely stupid, because the Russians can shoot these things down so easily, especially with their hypersonic anti-missile missiles. So 2 versions of the conventionally armed Tomahawk are currently in service. The BGM-109D Tomahawk and Land Attack Missile, dispenser with cluster munitions, range of 700 miles. Then the BGM-UGM-109E Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, with a 1,000-pound high explosive warhead and a range of 1,000 miles. Now, the Tomahawk has gone through a number of upgrades since it entered service in the 1980s, called Blocks 1, 2, 3, and 4. Block 4 is the current version. A Block 4 missile can be rerouted in flight to either pre-planned or new targets, according to the Missile Threat Project. Furthermore, the missile has a faster launch timeline and a loiter capability. Well, that's interesting. Along with its electro-optic sensors, allowing it to provide real-time damage assessment of previous strikes. What's that mean? Well, you send in a couple of Tomahawks and they make a hell of a mess. And you got a third Tomahawk coming in behind them. And it's got forward-looking cameras that can see where these other Tomahawk hits have taken place, and you can alter the course of the Tomahawk. And you think, boy, that's a great idea. You can just zero it right in at the last second. You know, it's like a pitcher in a Major League Baseball game. And if there was some way at the very end of that 100-mile-an-hour pitch, there's some, with a use of string or something, guide that baseball within the strike zone in an area where the noted batter up at the plate has a history of problems in that particular area of the batter box, so that you can strike them out every time. Well, according to Wikipedia, the RC-135U is designed to collect technical intelligence on adversary examiner radar emitter systems. And the data it collects is used to develop newer upgraded radio warning receivers, radar jammers, decoys, anti-radiation missiles, training simulators. This is different from the RC-135V Rivet John, which is the aircraft most commonly seen on these flights. The Rivet Joint, I said John, I meant joint. The Rivet Joint signals intelligence for a wide variety of purposes, including targeting, while the Combat Scent is more specialized for the suppression of enemy air defenses. Well, this is all public information. Like I said, it's in Wikipedia. This is the kind of stuff the Russians are looking at. And the Russians are probably looking at one another saying, haven't these guys seen what our hypersonic missiles can do? And Putin has said as early as 2 years ago, the placement of any kind of long-range missiles in the Ukraine that seriously upgrade the ability of NATO to attack Russia directly inside Russian borders will be met with retaliatory provocation and to the retaliatory action against the government that provided those missiles. Does that mean Norway would be a target? Well, of course it will be. They've made that very, very clear. You can bet on that. All right. Probably the email I have received the most here in the few minutes that are left to address today was Charlie Kirk. The execution that just won't go away. His message regarding financial pressure that was placed on him by those who wanted him to support Netanyahu's policies, right or wrong, that's been heavily publicized by Candace Owens, especially her last Monday YouTube podcast. The next day, a spokesman for Turning Point, Andrew Colvett, stepped up and confirmed Owens' report. On September 8th, which was 2 days before the execution, Kirk had written in a private chat with people in the government of his refusal to yield to pressure to cancel another appearance of Tucker Carlson. The message said this: I just lost another huge Jewish donor, $2 million a year because we won't cancel Tucker. Then in the second message, he said, quote, I have no choice but to leave the pro-Israel cause. Now, it has been asserted ever since his execution that the main reason for it was turning his back on Israel, in the sense that for years, Turning Point USA encouraged ecumenical kids and youth that he was bringing to Jesus support Israel as God's nation in the Middle East, as God's holy people. Well, after he saw enough evidence of what God's holy people are doing to the Palestinians, he decided, well, maybe they're not God's holy people, and he can't, with full purpose of heart, support that anymore. And people, well, that's speculation, that's conspiracy, and then Candace Owens comes out with her information, and now it's just coming out from several different news sources. Again, the message said, I just lost another huge Jewish donor. Now, Colvett offered the explanation on the day or just before the murder, the Charlie Kirk show. He said that they had not made these messages public before now, as they were from a private conversation that did not necessarily comport with things that were already made public. He then shared a screenshot of the private chat in question. Excuse me. Then Colvett added that the messages leaked by Owens were consistent with Kirk's previously expressed views on Israel and the Gaza war, and he reported that Kirk repeatedly expressed frustration about the pressure from pro-Israel groups describing their treatment to him as repulsive. He said that Kirk wanted to have the freedom to criticize Israeli policies without facing backlash. Well, who do you think you are, John F. Kennedy? Look what happened when Kennedy refused to give them nukes. Well, we're coming up towards the end of the program, and there's other things I wanted to get into. I saw this one little blip in the Washington Post that agents from the FBI have been reassigned from complex international investigations involving terrorism, drug trafficking, cyber crimes, counterintelligence. There are about 13,000 FBI agents in America, and nearly 25% of them have been transferred to working on immigration enforcement. This is in a report in the Washington Post over the weekend. 25% dropping cybersecurity investigations, white-collar crime investigations, all this other stuff. They're now involved with immigration enforcement. However, in the large cities, the number is closer to 40% of the currently stationed FBI operatives in that area. 40% of them are now working on immigration. This obsession with immigration has lowered morale in the FBI as agents dedicate less time towards the cases that they think are directly involved with national security. So critics complain that even the August reassignment of over 100 agents from the local FBI field office in Washington to do night shifts patrolling the streets was an underutilization of talent. It slowed down other investigations, distracted the office most responsible for protecting the nation's capital. Yeah, well, let me finish with some more exciting news. Oh, is it 8:58? Egypt wants to put bulldozers and engineering equipment on the ground in Gaza as soon as possible in order to begin the repair and clear the damaged roads and ensure an uninterrupted flow of humanitarian aid. I can probably pick this up tomorrow. But this is, they're meeting in Egypt today. Kushner and Whitcomb and whoever else is a part of the let's turn the Gaza Strip into, the Las Vegas Strip. Let's do the same thing we did there. Interesting time to be alive, isn't it? I mean, the news changes. Just, my goodness, almost daily. The news is changing with these kinds of things taking place. Tomorrow, I would like to spend a little time on the U.S. troops deployment, the posse comitatus stuff, and the deploying of U.S. troops inside the United States in order to quell what, the governors of these states, Oregon, Illinois, Chicago. Oh, there's no insurrection going on. We don't need the Insurrection Act. There's no Insurrection Act. There's just, a few gangs here in South Chicago have an issue with one another, and it's nothing that we can't handle ourselves. I will get into that some more tomorrow. Perhaps Matt Gaetz is what AIPAC did with him. I thought that was interesting. Oh, and another important announcement. I've got 2 or 3 new patient spots left between now and the end of the month. I am offering the K-Talk Nuka special. If you mention the word K-Talk, you can have what I do at half price. I'm not offering that to anybody else. I only offer it to the K-Talk audience between now and the end of October. If you just say the word K-Talk, you can become a patient with all the initial costs and care and x-rays and everything else that's involved with getting you back on your feet for half price. All right, that's going to do it for K-Talk. The phone number is 801-523-1890, 801-523-1890. And whoever answers the phone, just tell them that you heard me talk about that on the radio this morning. And for the streamers, thank you for your, it's a bigger number today. Good. I hope this was good. A lot more on updates and what's going on around the planet tomorrow, because the missiles of October is getting pretty serious. It's getting very serious. And the Brits just are not stepping down whatsoever. All right, I think that will do it. You keep your wits about you out there. Always be on the lookout. Don't be frightened and don't be terrified, and just keep your wits about you. And make sure there's some good common sense behind the decisions you make. I'll see you all tomorrow.